We're here with Dr. Anthony Lambert to talk about culture, communication and society. First question for you is, why study culture, communication and society at Macquarie?
Look, I think it goes back to the beginning of Macquarie, really. Macquarie started in the mid-1960s, and it was, a ferocious time for cultural and social change. And in the middle of that, the university emerged as a pioneering university. So it was asking a lot of questions about, Australian life and the global situation. So culture and communication and society comes to that and really works through those asking questions in really kind of provocative and interesting ways, but ways that advance our ideas about what it means to live in a culture and to communicate both in a local sense and a global sense. At Macquarie, of course, we've got a range of amazing scholars that are internationally recognised. We have, being, I guess, new in comparison to some of the older universities, that differentiates us from older places and structures and even facilities. So we have world-class, new, progressive and changing facilities. We also managed to marry the typical disciplines that you see in older universities with new, forward-thinking and progressive kind of disciplines like cultural studies, communication studies, and the relationship to study of society and media as well. So I would say because we are modern thinking, forward thinking, and I would say because we're a little bit different and a little bit more progressive in terms of our approach and our facilities when it comes to teaching and studying communication and culture.
And you did touch on it, but what is the value of studying culture, communication, society more generally?
Well, I think it's really important that we understand culture, all of us, and it becomes more and more important with the advent of social media and the kind of globalizing impact of digital technologies. We really do have to understand the world that we live in a little bit better, and most of us has to take ownership for the things that we consume and we produce. So we're really focusing on things like personal and community experiences. We're focusing on those larger media events. We're focusing on the practices and performances of our everyday life. We're focusing on relations of power between individuals and societies, between groups as well. So all of these things shape and govern the world we live in a whole range of ways, creatively, legally, institutionally, governmentally. And so we need to kind of have an understanding of that. And that's the primary focus of what we do in culture and communication studies at Macquarie. We start from a really, and it's not necessarily simple, but it's certainly a kind of straightforward teleology about human practices. So practices of meaning making, so let's say practices of signs, practices of the way that we communicate meaning, practices of the self, practices of the way that we actually understand our own subjectivity. That's our identity in relation to the world, in relation to larger institutions, law, school, science, the communities that we belong to, and also social practices. What are the rituals and the behaviours that we use to function as a society, and how can we change those, evolve those, transgress those, interrogate those? So these questions are really important, and if I boil all that down, it kind of becomes self plus meaning equals society, or meaning plus society equals self. There's a kind of triangular yet circular relationship between all of those things that we try to account for. We also do focus on cross-disciplinary studies in communication and cultural studies. So we look at not strict boundaries between what you learn. This is communication studies. This is cultural theory, for example. We look at the way those things are porous, the way they cross over and bleed into each other, but not just those disciplines, but other disciplines too, because everything's cultural, right? Everything's communication, right? So those things are really important in every aspect of our lives. So we try to focus on critical theory, performances, human behaviours, and a whole range of ways that we participate in the world we live in.
Thank you. And you mentioned before that we had some of the leading experts in this field in our staff. How is this field taught by these experts?
Look, it's interesting, and I think it comes back to the idea that communication studies and cultural studies are transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary, so they cross over quite a lot. We have people that are well known for things like post-humanism, that's our relationship between bodies and technologies and our environment, such as our department head, Nicole Anderson. We have experts in biometrics and race studies, such as Joseph Pugliese. We have people who are experts in robotics and performance, such as Yuji Sohn, or people that are experts in environmental humanities, Ian Collinson, experts in the ethics of law, Kate Ross-Manoth, myself, who's working on media and national identity and film and television in the Australian context, Terry Semp's work on social media. So what happens when we put all these people together? What do our courses look like? How does it feel? How does that actually construct a learning environment? You've got people who are at the top of their game. teaching us how to really interact with communications technologies and meaning-making practices across the whole landscape of media and society. So our experts generally then try to work on an approach that marries cultural and critical theory with the creative practices involved in performance and the institutional practices involved in government and NGOs and the practices involved in participating in a whole range of different cultural settings. What we want to do is marry theory with practice. That's the kind of bottom line, and that's pretty much at the core of the way in which our experts teach. The way that kind of, pans out across the life of the degree and across our disciplines, we end up with things like visual culture studies, disability studies, digital storytelling, histories of representation, textual analysis. We look at all types of media writing. We look at policy making, and we look at really creative approaches to social problems and cultural ideas and cultural phenomena. Remember before that I said that we focus on cultural events, spectacles if you like. Everything does come through as some kind of cultural event. We're living through a range of cultural events at the moment, and we'll probably chat about that in a minute. But it's really important that we understand a literacy of media and cultural events. So this is what happens when we bring our experts together. We explore topics such as bodies, technologies, film and TV, visual media, architecture, food, writing, performances of all kinds, because in communication and cultural studies, we view all kinds of behaviours as performative or being performances. We look at the environment in particular and our relationship to that too. So human development in the world around us is what we focus on, and our experts come together to make that story work across our courses.
And that leads really well into my next question actually, and a lot of students wonder this, but are there practical components to this field?
Well, you wouldn't think so given what seems to be the initial focus on critical theory and cultural studies in particular, but there are. A lot of our units, in fact at the first year level, have explicit focus on things like digital technologies and digital design, so you will enjoy and explore a lot of those things. Most of the units in communications and cultural studies require you to present, and that presentation process involves using a range of technologies in really creative ways. So that's actually in the learning outcomes for those units. So it's really important that you get a handle on creative responses to real world problems, as I said before. Keep in mind also that our courses enable you to move within and between a range of different subject areas. So you will move into areas such as media, as performance studies, screen production, writing. So you will take up electives, or even as part of your degree, you'll experience units that invariably immerse you in the production context, from performance to writing, screen production, as I've said. So there are a range of different creative options. On top of that, students are often involved in internships or in the PACE program, which is professional and community engagement. So they go off campus and work maybe on set. Maybe they work for a government department. Maybe they work with a club or a leisure group. Maybe they work in a cultural or charity group. Either way, they're always doing something creative or something that focuses their skills in ways that they can use them when they leave the university. And that's really important.
And just elaborating on that, what kind of careers can studies in this field lead to?
I mean, there are a range of skills that you get from this. I mean, it might sound incredibly broad, but they are quite specific. The research skills that you get and the ability to be media literate, the ability to write and communicate in really concise ways is important. So we see a lot of our students moving into areas of journalism, education, particularly policy writing. We also see them becoming performers as well as writers. So we see them becoming actors, we see them becoming filmmakers, they work in screen production. We have quite a few that have become, television journalists, for example. We have a few that have become writers in a whole range of different areas, but we also see people moving into community work, becoming advocates, for community groups and for different NGOs and even government departments, as I've said before. We see people going back into academia. I have some students that are, kind of nipping at my heels as we speak, because they're really that good. So the ability to communicate and the ability to navigate the cultural landscape via media technologies and via an understanding of human experience is what drives our candidates and takes them into a whole range of social areas.
And given the current changes in the world, where do you think studies of culture and communication fit in?
Look, I think the study of culture and communication is absolutely crucial at this time. We're going through a range of social changes. I mean, COVID-19, for example, the whole range of movements around identity following the death of George Floyd in the US, movements such as Black Lives Matter, Australian Indigenous movements, for example, as well. All of our courses in culture and communication are what I would call humanitarian. I would call them interventionist. You know, they move in and within and around social problems and media events. And in doing so, they have a lot to say about those things. So we can critically analyse them, but a lot of the assessments involved in our courses require people to pose problems, to pose problems and then actually answer those problems, to pose solutions, if you like, as well. In one of our units, Mobile Cultures, we look at ways in which we could use mobile technology to advance particular social movements or to better the lives of people that are in different marginalised groups in society. So at this point in time, when we're asking questions about identity, we're asking questions about our relationship to power, our relationship to the media. You know, here come a group of people that can be advocates, that can be writers, that can be performers, that are speaking to society on a whole range of levels and different platforms and places. So now more than ever, culture and communication is key.
Thank you so much for all those insights. Really, really valuable lessons there. We're going to cross now to our live Q&A. Hello and welcome to our Culture, Communication and Society live Q&A. Feel free to leave your questions in the live chat. My name's Adam. I'm in my 6th year at Macquarie University doing a double degree of Law and Media, and I'm joined today with our guest, Dr. Anthony Lambert. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
My first question to you is, in all of today's society, like what is the relevance of cultural studies?
Right, I mean, well, cultural studies, I think as I've already said in our recorded segment, it dates back to the 1960s and 50s where there were periods of really intense social change. And I think at the moment it's particularly important. I feel like cultural studies is having a bit of a resurgence since the 50s and 60s, particularly given this kind of critical juncture that we're in at the moment when it comes to issues of race and sexuality. We've seen global riots and movements in recent times that I think cultural studies, through its really unique and critical attention to social issues and phenomena, really helps us pull those things apart and understand how they're constructed in the media, how they work as social phenomena. So now more than ever, this discipline has really come into its own and become ever more important. I think also other issues, larger global events, COVID-19, even in Australia, when we were going things like same-sex marriage, you know, things that really grip the nation and determine the way that we behave as a group, really need to be analysed and understood. And we need people to think about the way those things are mediated and also to kind of arbitrate those things too and advocate for people in a whole range of different ways. Cultural studies does that. Cultural studies offers students in particular a literacy of cultural movements, cultural events and the way they're mediated and constructed socially and how that works for everybody, not just individuals but also groups, not just countries but also towns. So we're talking about culture in personal and public ways and the ways in which those movements are really affected by what we learn and how we understand them.
I don't think there's ever been a more important time to be able to critically analyse media and its, I guess, intersection with culture as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, looking at COVID, of course, it's become the ultimate media spectacle. And one of the things we teach in the majors in media culture and communication and cultural studies is to pull apart those things. How do media events work? How do they impact? How do we experience them? And what aspects of culture are actually informing the way that we experience them and our views? We've seen a lot of stuff about COVID-19. Is it real? Is it not real? People are dying every day. Anti-mask wearing, you know, movements towards closing borders. You know, we've all now suddenly learnt what a hotspot is, a cluster is. You know, this whole new lexicon that we have to learn and live by. You know, cultural studies, I think, really is one way of navigating and negotiating the shifting kind of sands underneath us, if you will.
Okay, and the next live question we have coming through is, what is the difference between doing a major in cultural studies and doing a major in media, culture and communications?
Right. Well, cultural studies, as I think I've already indicated, is primarily focused on cultural phenomenon. So in a kind of major in cultural studies, we would look at things like bodies, and race and sexuality and gender, and we'd look at them in a multi-sited way, the way that they operate across media representations, policy documents, politics, law, school, education, science. So we're looking at the ways in which people represent themselves to each other across a range of different sites and ways, and we use really sophisticated theoretical frameworks to analyse those things. And so again, that study of culture as a kind of crucial understanding of the contemporary is right there. In the media, culture and communication major, we're looking kind of equally at all three of those things. So you're looking at media studies and you're looking at the essential aspects of those things, but in a combination with the study of culture that I've just talked about. So all those issues to do with bodies and race and sexuality and politics and global phenomena too. And you're looking at communication, models of communication. I mean, we have a long history of the ways in which communication is taught and the ways in which communication is understood. And we know from media changes and of course social media in the contemporary era that the way we study communication has to change too. So the idea behind the media, culture and communication major is that you can't just study one. Media is about communication. Media is about culture, you know, and culture is about media and communication as well. How do we draw definite lines between those things? Well, you can't. So the difference between cultural studies and the media, culture, communication degree is how we define what you study and where you look to study those things. In the media, culture and communication major, you're also going to be exposed to some of the more creative aspects of the media, which you are exposed to in cultural studies, but not in a kind of vocational production-based way either.
And just on that, are you given an opportunity to collaborate with other media disciplines during the degree?
Absolutely. I mean, you also have, you know, the opportunity to do electives, you know, and all of our courses taught in our department are cross-disciplinary, and as I said, I think in the recorded segment too, transdisciplinary. So you do go in and out of different disciplines and you look at how they work. In terms of collaboration, you might find yourself doing creative writing as part of your cultural studies degree, or you might find yourself writing for or in front of the camera or behind the camera in one of the other units that you've decided to do yourself. And again, in some of the group work that we do in all of the units in both majors, you might find yourself working creatively with other students. You might not be a film student. Someone you're working with might be, you know, and then you can actually speak to each other's talents and what you're both studying. So there's very much a collaborative sense that pervades the whole of both of those majors.
Yeah, and in media in general as well, because in my film degree, we actually had people from music record original music for some of our films, or we'd have people who specialize in radio broadcasting come and help us with sound. So I think in all of media, there's just this sense of collaboration with everyone working together. It's quite unifying, actually.
It is, and the beauty of it, I think, too, is also the reflective aspect. The fact that you're given chances to use theory to pull apart what you do, and that you're required to really look at yourself. How are you learning? How are you working? And how are you contributing to what's happening in the department and the units that you're studying? So it's very collaborative in that way.
And what does practical experience look like from a cultural studies perspective?
That's an interesting one. So, of course, we have the PACE, you know, which is, you know, community engagement, our program where you do a amount of time in your later years off campus and you get credited for that. That's kind of, I guess, a work experience or a kind of internship aspect of your degree here at Macquarie. In cultural studies, that can look like a lot of different things. I mean, we know that culture can be broad and quite specific. Historically, we've had people that have worked with cultural groups or NGOs, non-government organisations, to put together cultural events, to put through educational events as well. We've had people do everything from studying the teaching of Taekwondo to helping, you know, people with disabilities learn swimming. And then we've had people work in really politicised environments, you know, policy and government departments. We've also had people work on film sets, or people go overseas as part of a kind of, you know, educational tourist program as well. So there's a range of different ways. If it's cultural, and everything is, then you can find a way to study it.
Yeah, from what I've gathered from that, it's very, very broad and interdisciplinary almost. Like it seems like it covers a huge spectrum of opportunities as well.
It does, but within the framework, of course, of how we learn, you know, within that idea of guided and self-reflective learning that is informed by critical ideas.
Yeah, and we have another interesting live question come through. Are you able to do modules in cultural studies as part of another degree? Because this student thinks it'd be useful for critical thinking.
It is, absolutely, and we have a lot of students that do that. I have a lot of students actually in my first year course on visual media and communication and my second year course on Australian film and television that come from teaching, that come from law, that even pick up 1 or 2 units and they're in science or in accounting, or in computing. And I think they're absolutely right. The reason for that is because we're teaching literacies here. Literacies of media, literacies of society. It helps you analyse, but it helps you speak more confidently, I think, about the issues of the day. You're also able to bring this kind of interventionist or humanitarian aspect into what can be sometimes some very dry areas of study.
Right, and I think this will probably be our final question. You offer a major in international communications.
Yes.
What would someone expect to study in international communication?
Right. The international communications thing also, of course, feeds into the media, culture and communication degree as well, so there is a bit of overlap there. But specifically, it focuses on things like overseas or international relationships and the ways in which we communicate globally. So there's a unique opportunity in the international communication major to look at nations, less developed nations, and how media works in those areas, how we can use communication for action and change. So we look at things like soft power. How does power work? How do different countries communicate themselves using really kind of implicit forms of power through media and communication? And we look at the relationships between different media ecologies, and different communities. And that's really important. I think that feeds back into culture and communication more broadly as well.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Lambert. That was incredibly interesting.
Great.
If you'd like to find out more, continue to ask your questions. Someone will be getting back to you. Otherwise, feel free to check out our other areas of study, head over to Studio Central and see what's going on, or partake in one of our competitions. Otherwise, we'll be seeing you next at 1 o'clock for our presentation on media and communications. Thank you so much for joining us.